we are going to ask for full membership for the Palestinian state.
Israel wants peace with the Palestinian state, but the Palestinians want a state without peace.
I think the day after Palestine will be admitted to the UN, Israel knows that it cannot get away with it. It will be held accountable.
No matter what happens or doesn't happen at the UN, the next day is not going to result in the kind of changes that the United States wishes to see.
This is Our World is Communications. My name is Mark Gonzales, coming to you from my home in San Antonio, Texas. Home. For many years now, the Israelis and the Palestinians have fought each other over a land they both call home. While the Israelis have Israel, the Palestinians continue their struggle for their own independent state. Palestinian statehood will be the subject of today's topic. The news media, an analysis of news framing on coverage of Palestinian statehood. The power of the news media to, in effect, set the public agenda, make it an important public institution where public trust is at its core. It is this trust that is at the heart of efforts by news editors to be objective gatekeepers of news content being broadcast. The challenge is maintaining objectivity when framing the news. James Tankard's definition of a media frame is especially helpful in understanding this important responsibility. Found in M. Griffin's 7th edition of A First Look at Communication Theory, Tankard defines a media frame as the central organizing idea for news content that supplies a context and suggests what the issue is through the use of selection, emphasis, exclusion, and elaboration. Today, Israel, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and much of the rest of the world agree that Palestinian statehood is a major step to bringing peace to the Middle East. Such an agreement remains elusive as disagreement continues on issues that include the division of Jerusalem, the state of Palestinian refugees, and the fate of Jewish settlements on Palestinian land. Despite these challenges and opposition from Israel and the United States, in September of this year, the PLO submitted its bid for Palestinian statehood to the United Nations. An analysis of news framing in the news media will be applied to the subject of Palestinian statehood in the news as covered online by CNN and Al Jazeera. These news channels were chosen because they broadcast their news to a worldwide population and are known for their agenda-setting effect on public policy. The analysis will compare and contrast a selection of 14 news articles, 7 from each news outlet, between September and November 2011. News coverage will be evaluated for emphasis and bias based on headlines, story leads, and story content. This includes analyzing news articles for language use, perspectives, and sourcing. Negative perceptions of objectivity are indicative of a phenomenon described by Hillel Nosek in his study, Our News and Their News, the role of national identity in the coverage of foreign news. Nosek presents evidence suggesting that matters of national loyalty trump matters of journalistic professionalism. The analysis of news framing by the two networks on Palestinian statehood revealed the challenging effect outlined by Nosek on the issue of national loyalty versus journalistic professionalism. First, CNN's headlines used framing consistent with the U.S. position on protecting the interests of Israel. Only one headline was neutral. 6 of the 7 headlines highlighted the negative effects of the Palestinian statehood request. Phrasing used included tough spot, coming to a boil, cuts UNESCO funding, freezes UNESCO funds, and bid stalled. One news story associated Palestine with Iran. Al Jazeera framed its headlines consistent with the Arab position of supporting the interests of the Palestinians. The issue was framed in a mostly neutral to positive light. 3 of the 7 headlines used positive phrasing associated with Palestinian forward progress. Phrasing included rally and support, clears way, and will push. 3 headlines were neutral and 1 was negative with the term condemn used to describe U.S. actions against UNESCO. Next, CNN's story leads were framed similarly to its headlines. 4 of the 7 story leads highlighted the negative effects of the Palestinian statehood request. They included a stalled peace process, the possibility of vetoing a UN resolution, a sharp rebuke from President Obama, and cutting funds to UNESCO. A 5th story lead used an Iranian soccer victory over Palestine to paint the Palestinians as a subordinate to Iran. 2 story leads remained neutral in language. Al Jazeera framed its story leads similar to its headlines. 3 of the 7 story leads highlighted forward progress, positive reactions, and positive results. They included Palestinians' preparation to submit their bid, Palestinians gathering to show support, and Palestinians' first diplomatic victory. Another 3 story leads remained neutral in language. One story lead was negative, explaining that the U.S. government cut funding to UNESCO. Finally, story content by CNN included 2 articles that were biased towards the American-Israeli position. One was biased based on the use of a negative connotation in the article theme, and one was biased towards the Palestinian position. Sources used in the 7 articles varied between 2 and 8, with no apparent correlation between the number of sources and bias. The overall content of the 7 CNN articles tended to balance out any apparent bias. Story content by Al Jazeera included 1 article that held a neutral position. 5 articles were biased towards the Arab-Palestinian perspective, while 1 was biased towards the American-Israeli perspective. Sources used in the 7 articles varied between 2 and 5. They tended to be supportive of the Arab-Palestinian perspective and included third-party news analysts and Al Jazeera's own reporters. The overall content of the 7 Al Jazeera articles was heavily weighted on the Arab-Palestinian perspective. While the more experienced CNN was biased in its framing of headlines, news leads, and story content on individual stories, the composite of the story content from its 7 articles balanced out any apparent bias. The relatively new Al Jazeera remained biased in its news framing throughout coverage in its 7 articles, using sources that supported the Arab-Palestinian position, including its own journalists. Evaluating the news media through the analysis of news framing helps develop a better understanding of the challenge in presenting news objectively. This analysis is consistent with Nosik's finding that when covering a news event, national loyalty trumps matters of journalistic professionalism. My name is Mark Gonzales, and thank you for joining me here on Our World is Communications.